The sound of heavy motorcycle engines roaring outside my quiet suburban home wasn't something I ever expected to hear on a peaceful Saturday afternoon. But that's how it all began, and if you want to know how HOA corruption escalated into something far darker, stay with me until the very end, because this story will shock you to your core, and you'll never look at a neighborhood homeowners association the same way again. So make sure to subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because you don't want to miss how this battle unfolded. It all started when my wife Emily and I moved into a neighborhood that, at first glance, seemed normal. A picture-perfect community with neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted fences, and an HOA that promised to protect property values. But underneath that image was a simmering pit of arrogance and power-hungry. Board members who thought they were kings and queens. From day one, Karen, the self-appointed queen bee of the HOA, had her sights set on us because she saw us as outsiders, who wouldn't bend to her rules. Emily, a strong and kind-hearted woman, wasn't the type to be pushed around. And when Karen knocked on our door demanding that we fix the shade of paint on our garage because it wasn't in the approved palette, Emily politely told her that we had checked the guidelines and our color was fully compliant. Karen didn't like that. She hated being challenged, and from that moment forward, it became clear she was going to make our lives miserable. First, it was petty fines notes on our door claiming we hadn't mowed our lawn within the HOA's 3-day standard, even though it was perfectly maintained. Then came threats about removing the flower pots Emily placed by the front door, accusing them of being a tripping hazard. We ignored most of it, paid what we had to in order to avoid liens, but as weeks turned into months, the harassment grew bolder, and it wasn't just about the rules anymore. Karen would stand across the street and glare whenever Emily watered her plants, even whispered to neighbors, painting us as troublemakers. I could deal with all of that. But when Karen and the rest of the board decided to escalate things by hiring muscle, that's when the line was crossed. On that Saturday, Emily had been home alone while I was running errands. She was out front trimming the rose bushes when she heard the thunder of engines, and suddenly, 3 massive motorcycles pulled up to the curb. The men who got off looked like they'd stepped out of a bad action movie, tattoos covering their arms, leather jackets with patches that didn't belong to any local riding club, and a roughness in their posture that screamed intimidation. Emily froze, unsure of what was happening. But when one of them swaggered up the driveway and said, "Your husband needs to learn how to respect the rules around here," her heart nearly stopped. They weren't there to chat. They were there to scare her. Karen had actually sent bikers to our home to frighten my wife into submission over HOA nonsense. Emily, despite her fear, held her ground, telling them to get off our property. But their leader smirked and leaned closer, muttering something about accidents happening if people don't cooperate. That was when I pulled into the driveway. The sight of me stepping out of my truck, groceries still in hand, must have shifted the entire dynamic. Because my background wasn't something most people knew about. I wasn't just some homeowner. I had a history in security and a reputation for dealing with situations far worse than a few thugs playing tough. The bikers didn't know who they were messing with, but they were about to find out. My voice cut through the tension as I demanded they step away from Emily, my tone calm but carrying an edge that made them hesitate. The leader turned, sneering, and asked if I was the guy who thought he didn't have to play by the rules. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I don't play by your rules. I sure as hell don't answer to people sent here to intimidate my family." Something in the way I said it must have clicked because for the first time, the cockiness on his face flickered. He wasn't expecting resistance, and he definitely wasn't expecting someone who wasn't afraid. But I wasn't done. The groceries on the porch stepped forward, let him feel the weight of my presence. It's not with fists, but with the unshakable confidence of someone who had dealt with real threats before. Within 3 minutes of arriving, the same bikers who had been puffing their chests and throwing around threats were backing up, their tough guy act crumbling as I laid out very clearly what would happen if they ever came near my wife or my property again. The neighborhood had started to gather, neighbors peeking from windows and porches. Watching this confrontation unfold, and the so-called enforcers quickly realized they were in way over their heads. Their leader, suddenly pale, muttered something about just delivering a message before motioning to his buddies to leave. The roar of their engines was loud as they sped away, but not nearly as loud as the silence they left behind. A silence filled with stunned neighbors who had just witnessed Karen's latest scheme explode in her face. Emily rushed into my arms, shaking, and I held her tight, promising that I'd never let anyone lay a hand on her. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to give up after being humiliated, and if she was willing to send bikers to our door, what would she try next? That's when I made a decision. I wasn't just going to defend my family. I was going to fight back against this HOA with every tool I had, and by the time I was finished, Karen would regret. Ever thinking she could use fear to control us? That night after the bikers left and Emily finally calmed down enough to fall asleep, I sat alone in the living room staring at the flickering streetlights outside our window, replaying every moment in my head and feeling a slow burn of anger building in my chest, not just because Karen had dared to target my wife, but because she had involved dangerous outsiders to do her dirty work, crossing a line that could have gotten someone hurt. And as much as I wanted to brush it off, I knew that if I didn't respond decisively, she would only escalate further, till our lives were consumed by her obsession with control. I had dealt with people like Karen before in my professional life, narcissists who fed on fear, manipulators who thought power came from intimidation. But one thing I'd learned was that when you confronted bullies head-on and took away their ability to scare you, they almost always crumbled, and that was exactly the strategy I was going to use. Early the next morning, I pulled out the box I hadn't touched in years, the one tucked away in the back of the garage under tarps and tools, filled with files, recordings, and equipment from my old line of work, a career Emily didn't talk about much with the neighbors because it was easier to let people assume I was just another guy with a regular job. The truth was, before settling into this community, I had spent over a decade in private security consulting, specializing in counter-intimidation tactics and investigative work for high-profile clients, which meant I knew how to dig up information, document threats, and use the law to crush anyone trying to play games. As I sifted through my old gear, an idea formed. I wasn't just going to wait for Karen to send another wave of harassment. I was going to build a case against her and expose everything she was doing to the neighborhood, because while she had painted us as rule breakers, the reality was she had been abusing her authority for years, fining people arbitrarily, manipulating votes, and funneling HOA funds toward her pet projects. It started with me installing a couple of discreet cameras around the property, the kind that captured clear audio and video without drawing attention. If Karen or her biker friends came back, I'd have undeniable evidence to hand to the police. But that was just the first step. The second was reaching out quietly to a few neighbors I trusted, people who had also felt Karen's wrath but were too afraid to speak up. The Wilsons across the street had once been fined nearly $1,000 for leaving their Christmas lights up too long, even though half the neighborhood still had theirs. The elderly Jenkins couple had been bullied into repainting their fence twice in a single year because Karen claimed the shade wasn't consistent. And then there was Daniel, a quiet single dad who had told me in passing that Karen had threatened to revoke his pool access if he didn't volunteer. At one of her HOA events, these weren't just isolated cases. This was a pattern. And when I sat down with them over coffee and told them about the bikers showing up at my door, their shocked expressions quickly turned into resolve. They were tired of Karen too. Together, we formed a small group, meeting secretly in my garage, where we began sharing stories, digging up old notices, and compiling everything into a timeline that painted a damning picture of the HOA's corruption. What struck me most was how many people had just accepted her behavior because they didn't think there was anything they could do. Karen had built an empire on silence and fear, but once the silence cracked, the truth poured out. Emily, still shaken from the confrontation, threw herself into helping, organizing documents and highlighting inconsistencies in the fines. Her calm determination only fueled my fire, and for the first time in months, I saw her shoulders relax a little as though standing up together was already lifting a weight off her. Of course, I knew Karen wasn't going to sit quietly while we gathered strength. Within a week, she made her next move. A certified letter arrived in the mail, claiming we owed the HOA nearly $2,000 in back fines for unapproved landscaping modifications. Emily nearly laughed when she read it, because all we had done was plant roses in our front yard, which was completely allowed. But the letter wasn't about rules, it was about pressure, about forcing us to break. Under financial threats, I didn't panic. Instead, I filed the letter carefully into our growing evidence folder. Because every baseless threat only added fuel to the fire I was building, that weekend something unexpected happened. The same bikers returned, but this time they weren't roaring into our driveway with menace. They parked further down the street, hesitated, and then walked up to me with a completely different attitude. The leader, the same guy who had smirked at Emily days earlier, now looked uneasy, almost apologetic, said they hadn't known what. They were really getting into that Karen had paid them under the table to scare us a little. But after our last encounter, they wanted no part of it anymore. In fact, he went further, saying if I needed, he'd even give me proof of Karen's payments to them, because the last thing they wanted was to be dragged into an actual criminal case. That was the moment I knew the tide had shifted. When your enemy's hired muscle starts begging to be left out of it, you know the person pulling the strings is losing control. I told them calmly that the best thing they could do was disappear and never come back. And if they really wanted to stay out of trouble, they should hold on to whatever evidence they had in case the police came knocking.
Ow!
They nodded quickly and left, leaving me with a new weapon. I hadn't expected confirmation that Karen had crossed into illegal territory. That night, when I told Emily what had happened, she couldn't believe it. "She's unraveling," Emily whispered, her voice a mix of relief and disbelief. And she was right. Karen's arrogance had blinded her to how far she'd pushed things. And now she was teetering on the edge of consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. The next step was clear. I wasn't just going to keep collecting evidence quietly. It was time to bring the fight into the open. I started drafting a detailed complaint to the County Housing Authority, outlining every instance of harassment, every fraudulent fine, and now even the use of intimidation through hired bikers. At the same time, Daniel and the Wilsons began talking to more neighbors, discreetly feeling out who else was fed up, and the support we uncovered was staggering. Nearly half the community had a story about Karen's bullying. Some were small annoyances, but others were heartbreaking, like the elderly widow who had been forced to remove her late husband's garden gnome collection because it didn't fit the aesthetic standards. These people had lived under her thumb for years, and now, for the first time, they saw a chance to push back. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't just going to roll over because a few of us filed complaints. She thrived on control, and she would fight tooth and nail to keep it. But as I looked at Emily, standing stronger than I'd ever seen her, at our neighbors slowly finding their voices, I realized Karen had already lost the one thing that made her powerful: fear. Once fear is gone, a tyrant has nothing left. The silence after the bikers were thrown out of my yard felt heavier than any roar of their engines. And for a moment the only sound was the faint hum of the cicadas in the trees and the pounding of my own pulse in my ears as I watched them retreat. To the end of the street, their leather jackets glistening faintly under the streetlights. Their bravado crumbling into shame as neighbors peered from behind curtains to witness their defeat. And though part of me wanted to relish in that quiet victory, I knew it was far from over, because men like that didn't give up simply because they had been embarrassed once. Especially not when money and influence from an HOA like ours was backing their little display of intimidation. And as I turned back to where my wife stood on the porch, her face pale, but her posture firm, I felt both the weight of relief that she was safe and the heavy responsibility that I would need to prepare for whatever escalation was bound to follow. My phone buzzed on the outdoor table where I had tossed it earlier, and when I picked it up, I saw a string of messages from a blocked number. Each one laced with thinly veiled threats about how I had crossed a line and how this wasn't over. And though I recognized the cowardice of hiding behind anonymity, I knew in my gut that the HOA board had their fingerprints all over this, with Karen leading the charge as usual. Her thirst for control blinding her to the recklessness of involving outside muscle in neighborhood disputes. A decision that might finally be her undoing. My wife reached for my hand, her grip trembling but steady enough to tell me she wasn't giving in to fear. And in that small gesture, I found the determination I needed to go on the offensive, because defensive victories only lasted so long. If you wanted peace with people like this, you had to expose them, strip away their layers of manipulation. It forced the truth into the open where no amount of HOA bylaws or intimidation tactics could hide it. That night, after I calmed my wife and made sure the locks were secured, I sat down in my study and pulled out a folder I had been keeping for weeks, maybe months, a collection of photos, recordings, emails, and testimonies from neighbors who had quietly confided in me about the board's misconduct but had been too afraid to speak out. And as I spread those papers across the desk, I saw a pattern emerging more clearly than ever before. Misuse of HOA funds, preferential treatment for certain homeowners who offered favors or money, and now, most dangerously, the employment of criminal elements to silence dissent. And though the folder wasn't complete enough to take to law enforcement, yet it was getting close. And I knew that the bikers' failed attempt at intimidation had given me both leverage and urgency to finish the puzzle. I drafted a few messages to neighbors I trusted, asking if they had witnessed what had happened tonight and if they'd be willing to give statements. And within minutes, my phone buzzed with replies, cautious but supportive, with more than one neighbor expressing disgust at the board's behavior and a desire to finally push back. And though I warned them about the risks, I could feel momentum shifting, the first cracks forming in the HOA's facade of untouchable power. Around midnight, as I sat staring at the papers and notes scattered before me, I realized something chilling. If the board had resorted to sending bikers to my house in broad daylight, they were desperate, which meant they either had something very big to lose or something very big to hide, and whichever it was, it told me that the stakes were higher than I had initially believed. And if I wanted to protect my wife, my home, and my sanity, I couldn't just play defense anymore. I had to strike, and I had to do it soon. The next morning, I went through my normal routine deliberately, waving politely to a couple of neighbors while walking the dog, nodding at cars as they drove past, pretending that everything was perfectly fine, while inside my chest a storm raged. Because I knew the board was watching, waiting for me to flinch. And I refused to give them the satisfaction. And when I spotted Karen standing smugly at the corner with two of her cronies, her arms crossed as if she owned the entire block, I raised my coffee cup in a mock salute that made her scowl darken. That moment, small as it was, gave me the confidence that I was getting under her skin. Later that day, I drove out of town under the pretense of running errands. But in reality, I went to meet with a retired attorney I knew through an old business connection, a man named Douglas, who had once specialized in property and association law before hanging up his practice. And though he was hesitant at first, once I laid out the evidence I had collected, his interest sharpened, and he confirmed what I had suspected all along, that if I could prove the board had been misusing funds and engaging in intimidation, they could not only be removed, but also face legal consequences. And while he cautioned me about the difficulty of getting people to testify, he assured me that the law was on my side if I had the will to pursue it. Driving back, I rehearsed how I would explain this to my wife, how I would assure her that the danger was real but manageable, and though fear lingered in the pit of my stomach, so did determination, a fiery mix that reminded me of who I was. Before I ever bought this house, before I ever got tangled in the petty wars of suburban politics, I was a man who had built his life on resilience. No HOA, no matter how corrupt, was going to break that. But that night, as we sat on the porch with the cool evening breeze brushing past us, headlights appeared at the end of the street. And I recognized the same bikes from the night before rolling slowly back into the neighborhood, their engines growling like wolves, testing the perimeter of prey. And though my wife's grip tightened on my arm, I stood tall, because if they had come back for round two, I was ready not just to defend, but to turn the tables completely. The roar of the bikes grew louder as they rolled back into the cul-de-sac, their headlights cutting through the night like probing eyes, and though my wife's breath hitched beside me, I refused to show even the slightest crack in my resolve, because fear was exactly what they thrived on. And I had already decided that I wouldn't give them that satisfaction again. Not tonight, not ever. So I straightened my shoulders, stepped off the porch, and walked to the edge of my lawn with deliberate calmness, each footstep heavy with the message that this was my ground, my home. And I wasn't about to let them or the HOA board dictate otherwise. They slowed to a stop, 7 bikes in a line, the smell of oil and rubber filling the air, and from the center dismounted their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar down his jaw and eyes that had probably seen too many fights. But instead of swaggering like he had the night before, there was a stiffness in his posture, a flicker of hesitation in his glance toward his men. And I realized something crucial: they weren't here to intimidate me this time. They were here because they had no other choice. Someone higher up had demanded they make another appearance. And they already knew it was going to end badly. "We don't want trouble," the leader said, his voice gravelly but lacking conviction, and I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms. Because this was a very different tone than before, and it confirmed my suspicion that the HOA board likely. Karen herself had pressured them into making another show of force, even though they knew they were outmatched. "Then you shouldn't have come back," I replied evenly, my voice carrying just enough edge to remind them of what happened last time. And the leader glanced at his men before shifting uncomfortably, muttering something about just doing a job and easy money, which told me exactly what I needed to know. These weren't hardened enemies with personal vendettas. They were pawns in Karen's game, pawns who had realized far too late that they'd been placed on the wrong side of the board. I let the silence stretch, the cicadas filling the space between us, before I leaned forward slightly and said, "Here's the thing. I don't take kindly to people threatening my wife, my home, or me. You made a mistake once, and now you're making it again. But I'm a fair man. You walk away now. Tell the person pulling your strings that this is over, and I'll forget this ever happened. You come back again, and I'll make sure the law knows exactly who you are and what you've done. And I promise you, it won't be a slap on the wrist." My words seemed to hit harder than any punch could have, because the men shifted nervously, their leader swallowing hard before finally nodding. And I could see the thin veil of toughness slipping further with every passing second until finally, one of the bikers muttered under his breath that they shouldn't have taken this gig. And just like that, the momentum swung entirely in my favor. But before they could leave, I made one last move, pulling out my phone and snapping a picture of them and their license plates under the streetlight, the flash illuminating their startled faces, and I said, "Insurance," tucking the phone back in my pocket as their leader raised his hand slightly, not in aggression but in reluctant acknowledgement that they had been cornered. And without another word, they mounted their bikes and rolled out of the neighborhood. This time not with roaring defiance, but with the quiet retreat of men who had seen clearly the edge of a line they dared not cross again. My wife exhaled shakily, her relief palpable, but I knew better than to believe it was finished. Because for every pawn that gave up, there was still a queen on the board pulling strings, and Karen wasn't going to stop until she either broke us or was broken herself. The next morning, while the neighborhood buzzed with whispers of what had happened, some neighbors emboldened, others still fearful, I sat at the kitchen table with my wife and laid out everything I had gathered so far, explaining that the bikers weren't the real enemy, they were a symptom of something far deeper. A rot within the HOA that had to be cut out entirely, and though she was scared, her voice was firm when she said, "Then let's end this. Whatever it takes." That simple declaration lit something inside me, a fire that turned hesitation into action. And I spent the rest of the day contacting the neighbors who had responded positively before, arranging a quiet meeting at my house that evening where we could discuss next steps without the board's knowledge. By the time the sun dipped low, 6 neighbors had arrived, each one glancing nervously over their shoulders before stepping inside. And as I gathered them in the living room, I laid out the evidence, the photos, the testimonies, and finally, the story of what had happened with the bikers. And though shock rippled across their faces, anger quickly followed, because no one wanted to live in fear. No one wanted their families threatened in their own homes, and the idea that the board could stoop so low had pushed even the quietest among them into open outrage. We talked late into the night, plotting strategies from filing a collective complaint with county authorities to gathering signatures for a recall petition that could remove the board entirely. And though everyone understood the risks that Karen would retaliate. That the board might escalate further, the determination in the room was undeniable. And for the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I felt like we were more than just a collection of houses. We were a community, united not by fences or bylaws, but by a shared refusal to be bullied any longer. When the meeting ended, and my neighbors filed out with cautious optimism, I stood at the window watching the street, my mind whirling with possibilities, and in that quiet moment I realized the truth. Karen had overplayed her hand by bringing outsiders into our fight. And now the very people she thought she controlled were slipping through her fingers. But if I wanted to finish this, if I wanted to truly protect my wife and reclaim our home, I couldn't stop at defense. I had to be ready to bring everything into the open, even if it meant going to war with the HOA itself. The following days were tense, every shadow cast by the street lamps seeming sharper, every unfamiliar car passing through the neighborhood making me instinctively stiffen. But beneath that unease there was a current of determination building, both within me and among the neighbors who had sat in my living room just nights before. And it became clear that the balance of power was beginning to shift, because Karen and the HOA board no longer had the unquestioned obedience they once commanded. They had fear. Yes, fear cracks when it's pressed too hard, and now people were seeing through the illusion of their authority. My wife kept reminding me to stay calm, to think every step through. But I knew she also felt that spark of resolve because the way she walked around the house was different, her head held higher, her eyes sharper, no longer shrinking from the threats that had once made her tremble. On the third evening after the bikers had slunk away, I was mowing the front lawn when Karen herself strutted across the street, clipboard in hand as though it were some royal scepter, and she called out my name with a voice that carried the sweet veneer of fake politeness, but underneath it trembled the sharp edge of hostility. "We need to talk," she said, and I cut the mower off. Leaning against the handle with deliberate calmness, waiting for her to make the next move, she didn't waste time launching into accusations about disturbing the peace and harassing contractors and spreading lies about the board. Her words sharp and fast, like darts flung without aim. But the longer she spoke, the more her desperation showed, until finally I raised a hand and said, "Karen, the only lies being spread here are yours, and everyone's starting to see. Sending bikers to my home? Threatening my wife? Do you really think no one noticed? You think people are just going to keep bowing down because you've got a clipboard and a title?" Her face paled, just slightly, but then flushed red, and she sputtered that I had no proof, that no one would believe me. But I just pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the gallery to the photos of the bikers, and held it up where she could see the license plates gleaming under the streetlight. For a moment, her eyes widened in shock, and that flicker was enough to confirm what I already knew, that she had been behind it all. And when she saw the smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth, she snapped, turning on her heel and storming back across the street without another word, her retreat speaking louder than any argument could. That night, as I recounted the encounter to my wife, I realized Karen's grip was slipping faster than I had even imagined, and the only thing left was to push just hard enough to topple the whole facade. The very next evening, I hosted another meeting, this time with nearly double the number of neighbors, some of whom admitted they had been too scared to come before, but were now emboldened by the rumors of Karen's failed intimidation tactics. And together we drafted a formal petition to demand an emergency election to recall the board, each signature inked with both fear and defiance, because every person knew they were stepping into a battle, but no one wanted to live under tyranny anymore. But Karen wasn't done yet. She and her allies began patrolling the streets like self-appointed sentinels, sending out email blasts filled with threats of fines, talking about supposed violations that didn't exist, trying to claw back control through paper and fear. But instead of cowering, more people began pushing back, forwarding the emails to me, showing up at my house with stories of harassment. I started compiling everything into a thick binder of evidence that I knew would be powerful if we had to take this fight into court. The tension in the neighborhood was like a storm cloud ready to burst. And sure enough, it finally did one Friday evening when the board called a special community meeting in the clubhouse, clearly an attempt to intimidate us in public. But instead of being cowed, over half the neighborhood showed up, filling every chair and lining the walls. And when Karen took the microphone with her smug smile plastered on, expecting applause or at least silence, she was met with folded arms, narrowed eyes, and the weight of a community no longer willing to play her game. She started droning about dangerous elements in maintaining order, throwing not-so-subtle barbs in my direction. But before she could finish, one of the neighbors, a quiet man who had never spoken at any meeting before, stood up and said loudly, "We're not afraid of you anymore, Karen. We know what you did. We know about the bikers." The room buzzed with murmurs, eyes snapping toward her, and for the first time in public, her mask cracked, her face twitching in anger as she barked that it was all slander. But then another neighbor stood, and another, until finally I rose with the binder in my hand and said, "We have proof, photos, witnesses, testimonies, and if you think we won't take this to the county, to the police, you're sorely mistaken." The room erupted, half in cheers, half in chaos, and the board members shifted uneasily behind. Karen, as though suddenly realizing their ship was sinking and they didn't want to go down with it, though Karen shouted, banged the microphone, tried to regain control. The truth was clear. The people had tasted freedom from fear, and there was no going back. That night, walking home with my wife's hand in mine, I felt both exhilarated and wary, because though we had struck a massive blow, cornered animals are often the most dangerous, and Karen was not the type to surrender quietly. She would lash out one more time. Of that I was certain, and I needed to be ready when she did. The days following that explosive meeting at the clubhouse felt like living in the eye of a storm, calm enough on the surface that you could almost convince yourself the worst had passed. But underneath it all was a brewing force, something that promised to break with more fury than before, and every instinct I had told me Karen would not let the humiliation she endured in front of the entire neighborhood go unanswered. So I stayed vigilant, checking the locks on the doors twice before bed, keeping the phone charged at all times, and listening carefully when my wife would tell me she'd noticed unfamiliar cars parked at odd hours near the corner of the street, their engines idling too long, the windows tinted too dark, like shadows waiting for an opportunity to crawl into our lives again. Karen herself had gone strangely quiet. No more clipboard marches across the street. No passive-aggressive notes shoved in our mailbox. No threats of fines for imaginary violations. And that silence unsettled me more than her usual theatrics ever had, because it meant she was planning something, gathering strength, waiting for her chance to strike back, and the only question was how and when. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, the answer roared down our street in the form of motorcycles, their engines rattling the windows as a half-dozen bikers came rolling into the cul-de-sac like they owned it, their leather jackets gleaming, faces hard and unfriendly, but this time they didn't swagger with the same arrogance as before. This time they looked uneasy, their eyes flicking toward my house as though they were torn between duty and fear. When they dismounted, Karen appeared. At the far end of the street, arms crossed, lips curled in satisfaction, as though she had conjured them out of thin air. My wife froze at the window, her hand gripping my arm, but I told her calmly to stay inside, that I needed to handle this myself. I stepped out the front door with slow, deliberate movements, letting the screen slam shut behind me, with the sound that made the bikers flinch. They tried to puff up, tried to look intimidating, but I could see the tension in their shoulders. I could hear the hesitation in the way one of them cleared his throat before stepping forward and growling, "You've caused a lot of trouble. Maybe it's time you backed off." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled out my phone, held it up high where they could all see the red light of the camera recording, and said, "If you think threats are going to scare me, you're mistaken. The last time you were here, I let you walk away. I won't be so generous again." Karen, from her perch at the end of the block, shouted something about getting him out of here and showing him what happens to people who disrespect the HOA. But the bikers didn't move, their gazes darting between me, the camera, and Karen. And I realized they were starting to see what she was, someone who used others as pawns, sending them into battles she herself would never fight. One of them muttered, "This ain't worth it," but Karen snapped back at him, screaming like a banshee, her composure cracking as she realized her intimidation attempt was slipping away in real time. And finally I took a step forward, my voice low and steady as I said, "You're being used. Look at her. She doesn't care what happens to you. She just wants someone else to fight her battles. But me? I don't stop. You try to come after me or my wife again, and you'll regret it. You saw what happened last time. Do you want to repeat?" The air grew thick with tension, the bikers shuffling on their feet, Karen screeching like a cornered animal. But the longer the standoff dragged, the clearer it became that her plan had backfired, because instead of scaring me, the bikers were backing away from her, their loyalty cracking, and one by one, they got back on their bikes, engines rumbling to life. Till finally, the leader gave me a look that was half apology, half warning, and said, "We're done with this. She can fight her own battles." With that, they roared away, leaving Karen standing alone in the middle of the street, her face twisted in rage, her shrill voice chasing after them but drowned by the thunder of their exhaust. And the sight of her, powerless and abandoned, burned itself into my memory. Neighbors peeked through curtains and from behind doors, watching as the queen of the cul-de-sac suddenly found herself without her army. And though she tried to scream threats at me, telling me this wasn't over, that she would ruin me, I simply turned my back on her and walked inside, the message clear. Her time was done. That night, the phone calls started. Neighbors who had once been too afraid, now emboldened by the sight of Karen's failure, offering support, asking how they could help. And I told them the truth. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us, about reclaiming our neighborhood from the chokehold of someone who had mistaken power for ownership. Together we finalized the petition, gathered more signatures, and submitted it to the county clerk with a thick packet of evidence. Making it official, Karen and her cronies would face a recall vote, and for the first time, the future didn't look like endless intimidation. It looked like hope. But even as I felt that victory on the horizon, I knew Karen would try one last desperate move. Something reckless, something designed to make us regret ever challenging her, and I myself for it, because the battle wasn't over. It was about to reach its most dangerous point yet. The week leading up to the recall vote felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. The ground beneath us steady enough, but every gust of wind threatening to send us tumbling if we weren't careful. And while the neighborhood seemed to finally be waking up to Karen's tyranny, she wasn't about to let go without a final show of force. Because that was who she was. Someone who thrived on control. Someone who couldn't stand the thought of losing the power she had stolen for so long. And that Saturday, when the neighborhood gathered in the community hall to cast their votes, it became clear just how far she was willing to go. The room was packed, the air buzzing with tension as neighbors whispered among themselves. Some nervous, others determined, and when Karen walked in, she didn't bother with her usual fake smiles or pretenses of civility. She stormed through the door with a face red with fury, flanked by two of her remaining loyalists, who carried stacks of papers they tried to shove into people's hands, claiming they were proof that my wife and I were dangerous, that we were the reason the neighborhood was falling apart. But the crowd didn't bite, their patience for her theatrics long gone, and as the HOA board tried to bring order to the chaos, I could feel her eyes burning into me from across the room. A silent dare, a final attempt to intimidate me into backing down. When it was my turn to speak, I stood before the microphone, heart pounding but voice steady, and told everyone the truth. Not just about the bikers she had sent, not just about the harassment, the threats, the manipulation, but about what this neighborhood used to be before fear became the law of the street. And as I spoke, heads nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. I realized the spell she had cast over people for so long was finally broken. Karen tried to interrupt, screaming over me, calling me a liar, even lunging toward the microphone at one point, but the board cut her off, reminding her that this was her chance to defend herself, not disrupt. And when she finally did get her turn, her words poured out in a frenzy, not the polished control she once had, but the ramblings of someone who knew they were losing. Her accusations wild, her voice cracking as she shouted about conspiracies and betrayal, until finally one of the board members told her she had said enough. The votes were cast, slips of paper dropping into the box one after another. The silence so heavy you could hear the scratch of pens, the shuffling of feet, and when the counting began. Karen sat in the corner, muttering to herself, glaring at everyone who dared look her way. Her leg bouncing with restless energy, as if she was planning her escape before the verdict was even read. And then the results were announced. She was removed. Her presidency of the HOA officially over, the room erupting in applause, cheers echoing off the walls, people hugging, neighbors who hadn't spoken in years suddenly clasping hands, there. Relief palpable. And in the middle of it all, Karen stood frozen, her face pale, her jaw clenched, as though the reality of her downfall had finally pierced through her delusions. She didn't stay to hear the rest. She stormed out of the hall, her footsteps echoing like gunshots, slamming the door behind her so hard it rattled the glass. And though no one followed, we all knew it was the last time she would hold any power here. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed in ways that felt almost surreal. People talking again on their porches, kids riding bikes down the street without fear of being scolded for violations, families coming together for cookouts and block parties, and for the first time in years, the cul-de-sac felt like a home instead of a battlefield. My wife and I were thanked over and over, neighbors stopping by with pies, handshakes, even tears in their eyes as they told us how much they appreciated what we had done. But I reminded them it wasn't just me, it was all of us, because a person might start a fight, but it takes a community to win it. Still, late at night, when the world was quiet and I sat on the porch listening to the crickets, I couldn't shake the memory of the bikers, of the way Karen had nearly broken us with her relentless schemes, and I knew this story wasn't just about one HOA or one Karen. It was about the dangers of giving power to those who abuse it, and the strength that ordinary people find when they finally decide enough is enough. That lesson would stay with me forever, a reminder that no matter how intimidating someone tries to appear, no matter how many thugs they send to your door, truth and unity are stronger weapons than fear will ever be. And as I watched my wife smile, finally at peace, I realized the fight had been worth every sleepless night. And if you've made it this far into our story, if you've felt the anger, the fear, and the triumph with us, then you already know why I need to say this. Battles like these aren't just stories. They happen every day in neighborhoods across the country, and the only way we shine light on them is by sharing them. So don't forget, subscribe to Sham Stories on YouTube, because there are more tales of truth, justice, and unexpected twists waiting for you, and you won't want to miss what comes next.